Who were they? Shadows on the edge of history, faceless raiders who rose from the sea like ghosts. Their names have been lost, their language unrecorded, their origins debated for centuries. Yet their impact was undeniable. Empires crumbled, cities burned, and the Bronze Age itself collapsed in their wake. Imagine the world around 1200 BC. Palaces gleam in the eastern Mediterranean, Mycenaean kings feast in candlelit halls, Hittite scribes press clay tablets with imperial decrees, Egyptian pharaohs gaze upon temples rising like mountains of stone. To their eyes, civilization seemed eternal. But across the horizon, unseen, a tide was gathering. Ships with high prows and curved hulls cut through the waves, bearing warriors hardened by hunger and exile. Whole peoples were on the move, families as well as fighters, carrying their gods, their weapons, and their desperation. They came not as visitors, but as storms. History would remember them only as the Sea Peoples. A vague name for a vast catastrophe. And so we begin our journey, not with answers, but with questions. Where did they come from? Why did they strike? And how did they bring an entire age crashing down? The Late Bronze Age was an age of brilliance and fragility. Across the Mediterranean, a web of kingdoms bound together by trade and diplomacy flourished. Copper from Cyprus met tin from distant lands to forge bronze, the metal that armed armies and crowned kings. Merchant ships carried cedar wood, olive oil, and wine, scribes inscribed treaties in Akkadian, the international tongue of the day. It was a world interconnected, globalized in its own ancient way. But it was also a world balanced on a knife's edge. Behind the dazzling wealth of palaces lay droughts, famines, and restless populations. And from the Aegean to the Levant, rumors began to spread. Strange bands of outsiders were appearing, raiding coasts, harassing merchants, leaving villages in flames. The Egyptians would later describe them in grim detail, peoples from the midst of the sea, their origins unknown. They were many tribes, not one nation. The Peleset, the Sherdin, the Shikalesh, the Lutka, the Denyen. Names that survive only in the carved hieroglyphs of Egyptian victory stele. But to those who faced them, these names were not words, they were terror. The first signs were small, almost invisible. A merchant ship fails to arrive in port. A coastal town reports an attack from the sea. Traders whisper of strange helmets, round shields, and swords of foreign make. These raids could have been dismissed as piracy, the work of opportunistic marauders. But soon, it became clear, this was no band of pirates. This was a migration of warriors, entire communities shifting like tectonic plates across the Mediterranean world. Archaeology reveals their shadow. Around 1200 BC, Mycenaean fortresses begin to show signs of stress, walls hastily reinforced, settlements abandoned. The island world of Cyprus, once a hub of copper wealth, saw its great cities ravaged and rebuilt. In Anatolia, the Hittite Empire, once a titan of the Near East, began to falter, its capital Hattusa eventually reduced to ashes. The storm was gathering. Yet, for the kingdoms of the Bronze Age, the threat was not fully understood. To the courts of Mycenae, Ugarit, and Thebes, the Sea Peoples were little more than distant turbulence. Surely the great walls, the chariots, the armies of the kings would hold. But these raiders were different. They fought with an intensity that shattered the old ways of war. They brought women and children with them, suggesting not only conquest but resettlement. And where they struck, they did not merely plunder, they stayed. In the Levant, the city of Ugarit offers a haunting glimpse of their arrival. Clay tablets, buried in the final destruction of the city, record desperate pleas for aid. Enemy ships are burning our towns. Where are your troops? The appeal was written, but the help never came. Ugarit, a jewel of commerce and diplomacy, was left to the flames. The Sea Peoples were not a storm that passed, they were a tide that rose higher with each wave. And on the horizon, the greatest test was yet to come. For if they could topple mighty cities and harass distant kingdoms, what would happen when they reached the gates of Egypt, the oldest and most enduring power of them all? The shadows that had once lingered on the horizon were now coming into view. The Mediterranean world of the late 13th century BC was a stage of dazzling grandeur. Across the eastern seas, kingdoms rose like giants, their palaces gleaming with gold and their temples echoing with prayers to gods both benevolent and cruel. This was the high tide of the Bronze Age, an age of kings who believed their reigns would last forever. In Egypt, the Nile carved its eternal path through the desert, feeding fields that stretched in ribbons of green along its banks. Pharaohs stood as living gods, their likenesses carved on towering pylons, their armies organized, disciplined, and vast. To their north, the Hittites of Anatolia ruled from Hattusa, a city of colossal gates and stone lions, commanding a vast empire that stretched from the Black Sea to Syria. The Hittite kings, heirs of thunder and law, traded letters with Egyptian pharaohs as equals. Their treaties were inscribed on clay and sealed with divine oaths. Across the Aegean, the Mycenaean Greeks thrived. Hilltop citadels rose above the plains, their cyclopean walls built from stones so massive that later generations believed only giants could have raised them. In the megarons of Mycenae, Tiryns, and Pylus, kings presided over feasts where wine flowed and singers recited tales of heroes. Their fleets ranged across the seas, their warriors armed with spears, swords, and bronze armor that gleamed in the sun. Further east, in the Levant, the city-states of Ugarit, Byblos, and Tyre flourished. Their harbors teemed with ships, their warehouses overflowed with copper, ivory, and cedar. Ugarit in particular was a hub of international diplomacy, where scribes could write in 4 languages and merchants spoke in tongues from every shore. To walk through its streets was to hear the world itself in conversation. This was a network bound not only by trade but by trust. Kings wrote to one another as brothers, sending gifts of gold, silver, and brides. Bronze was the lifeblood of this world, forged from tin and copper drawn from lands far apart, tied together by fragile threads of cooperation. It was a system of immense beauty and immense vulnerability. And yet, beneath the grandeur, there were cracks. Drought gripped parts of Anatolia and the Levant, straining harvests. Restless tribes on the fringes, the Lukka in western Anatolia, the pastoral Shasu in the deserts, watched hungrily as cities grew fat with wealth. In Greece, infighting between rival palaces weakened unity. The world seemed strong, but its foundations were brittle. Still, the great powers believed themselves eternal. The Hittites continued to expand, pressing into Syria. Egypt, under the Ramesside pharaohs, maintained order along its frontiers, its armies boasting thousands of chariots. The Mycenaeans dominated the Aegean, their trade routes reaching as far as Sicily and the Levant. For centuries, this balance of power had endured, broken only by occasional wars, soon patched with treaties. But in the Mediterranean, the sea is both bridge and threat. It carries wealth as easily as it carries ruin. And across its waters, movements had begun, migrations of peoples stirred by famine, conflict, and ambition. The Sea Peoples, as they would later be called, did not appear suddenly. They emerged in the margins of this glittering world, pressing against the edges of its empires. They saw the wealth of Ugarit, the granaries of Egypt, the palaces of Mycenae. And they hungered. Still, in this chapter of the story, the storm has not yet struck. The world is radiant, its palaces intact, its kings secure in their divine right. In Egypt, priests chant hymns as incense curls toward the heavens. In Hattusa, scribes seal clay tablets recording vast shipments of grain. In Mycenae, the smith's hammer strikes bronze, shaping weapons for armies that no enemy yet dares to challenge. This was the last age of confidence, the final moment when kings believed their thrones were unshakable. A golden twilight, bright but fleeting. And as the sun set on this high point of civilization, dark sails were already being spotted on the horizon. The empires stood tall, but the tide of history was shifting. The storm was about to begin. At first, it was only rumor. Faint as a ripple across calm waters, whispers spread from harbor to harbor, from caravan to caravan. Sailors spoke of villages burned along distant coasts. Merchants, once confident in the safety of their sea lanes, returned home empty-handed, or did not return at all. Something was stirring beyond the familiar world, a disturbance no king yet recognized for what it was. In the late 13th century BC, this whisper became a murmur. The clay archives of Ugarit, buried beneath the ashes of its destruction, preserve letters of growing anxiety. Kings begged for shipments of grain to feed their people. Governors reported hostile ships prowling their shores. The tone of these letters is urgent, desperate, and yet uncertain. Who were these raiders? Were they pirates, mere scavengers of the sea? Or was something larger unfolding? The evidence began to accumulate. In Anatolia, the Hittites strained to hold their western frontier. The Lutka, tribes from the rugged coasts of southwestern Anatolia, were pressing harder, sometimes in league with mysterious allies. Egyptian records mention mercenaries, the Sherdin, fighting in the pharaoh's service, men of foreign dress and foreign weapons, fierce enough to be absorbed into the armies of Egypt itself. But if some fought for gold, others fought for survival. Entire peoples were on the move. Archaeologists trace the signs in abandoned settlements and layers of destruction. Around 1200 BC, the island of Cyprus, once a jewel of copper wealth, faced repeated assaults. Towns like Nkomi were destroyed, rebuilt, and destroyed again. It was as if the sea itself had turned against them, wave after wave of violence crashing ashore. For the great empires, these events were troubling, but not yet catastrophic. Kings had faced raiders before, the sea had always borne both trade and piracy. What they did not see, or refused to see, was that this was no ordinary storm. This was a movement of peoples. Families, warriors, and whole communities were leaving their homelands, driven by causes that remain cloaked in mystery. Climate change may have withered crops, earthquakes may have shaken foundations, wars elsewhere may have displaced them. Whatever the reason, they were coming, and they would not stop. The tension crackles in the surviving words of Hammurabi, the last king of Ugarit. In one desperate letter, he cries out, "The enemy ships are already here. They have set fire to my towns. Where are your troops? Where are your chariots?" His pleas were written, but no answer ever arrived. Before help could come, the city was obliterated. Palaces, libraries, temples, all consumed in flame. The words he wrote survived only because they were baked in the fire that ended his kingdom. To contemporaries, the picture was unclear. A ship lost here, a city burned there, a trade route severed, a harvest stolen. But taken together, these events marked the opening of a wider catastrophe. The sea peoples were not only raiding, they were testing, probing the defenses of the greatest empires of the age. And each successful strike emboldened them further. Still, in Egypt, in Hattusa, in Mycenae, there was a sense of distance. The storm was breaking on the edges, not yet at the center. The kings watched, wary but unconcerned, confident their walls and armies would endure. The Nile still flooded, the citadels still stood, the granaries still overflowed. Surely the foundations of the world were unshakable. But the whispers had become a roar. Ships with high prows and painted eyes prowled the coasts. Warriors with strange helmets and feathered crests carried long swords and round shields unlike those of their enemies. They came not in fleeting raids, but in fleets. And behind the warriors came families, women, children, carts laden with possessions. This was not plunder. It was migration. The old order of the Bronze Age was being tested in ways it had never known. And as the first cities fell to flame, the great empires began to realize that their world was no longer invulnerable. The whispers of a storm had become thunder on the horizon. And soon, the fire would reach the coasts of every kingdom. The Mediterranean in the early 12th century BC was no longer a sea of trade, it had become a sea of fear. Across its waters, dark sails multiplied, and the rhythm of commerce was replaced by the drumbeat of invasion. What began as scattered raids had swollen into full-scale assaults. Cities that had thrived for centuries collapsed in flame, their harbors choked with smoke, their people scattered or enslaved. The first to feel the fury were the coastal settlements of Anatolia and the Levant. Once bustling ports found themselves overwhelmed by fleets of long, narrow ships with curved hulls and high prows. Their warriors poured ashore with round shields, feathered headdresses, and double-edged swords, different from anything the chariot armies of the Bronze Age were used to facing. They fought not as scattered raiders but as disciplined bands, hardened by years of struggle. Cyprus, the copper heart of the Bronze Age economy, bore the brunt of this storm. Its riches had long made it a prize, and now its towns paid the price. At Nkomi, Archaeologists uncovered blackened ruins, skeletons left where they fell, storerooms of copper ingots cracked by fire. Repeated waves of destruction show how relentless the assaults were, one raid after another, until the island could no longer recover. The Hittites too felt the fire. Their empire, vast but brittle, relied on control of the coastal states that fed its armies and secured its trade. As the Sea Peoples swept through western Anatolia, Hittite authority crumbled. Vassals turned rebellious, harbors were lost, and supply lines snapped. The once mighty capital of Hattusa stood isolated in the Anatolian heartland, its power withering as the coasts fell away. Further south, the Levantine cities, Ugarit, Byblos, Ashkelon, became battlegrounds. Ugarit's desperate clay tablets, written in the very hours of its destruction, speak of fleets burning towns, of fields abandoned, of allies who never came. The fire that consumed Ugarit was so complete that its memory lingered only in buried archives, sealed beneath collapsed roofs. A city that had been a hub of languages and trade, a jewel of the Bronze Age, was snuffed out in days. These attacks were unlike anything the kings of the Bronze Age had faced. The old model of warfare had been dominated by elite chariot corps, swift, disciplined, devastating against infantry. But the Sea Peoples fought differently. Their infantry surged in waves, wielding cut-and-thrust swords that could pierce armor, their shields interlocked against arrows. Chariots, designed to dominate flat plains, found themselves vulnerable against swarming warriors who fought hand-to-hand with ruthless persistence. What made these invaders so dangerous was their purpose. They were not content with plunder. They sought new lands, fertile coasts, and permanent homes. Entire families moved with the fleets, women, children, carts, livestock, all evidence that this was no mere campaign of pillage but a migration of entire peoples. Where they landed, they stayed, transforming coastal landscapes into new frontiers. The panic spread like wildfire. Kingdom after kingdom faltered. In Greece, Mycenaean palaces once radiant with wealth fell silent. Mycenae itself, Tiryns, Pylos, all showed layers of destruction, their thrones toppled, their storerooms looted. Trade routes collapsed, scribal traditions vanished. What had seemed eternal crumbled in a single generation. Yet even as the storm consumed the Aegean, Anatolia, Cyprus, and the Levant, one land stood as the ultimate prize. Egypt. The Nile, eternal and abundant, was the richest land of them all. Its granaries could feed thousands, its temples overflowed with treasure, its pharaohs stood as living gods. And to a people on the move, desperate for land and survival, Egypt shone like a beacon. The coastal fires were only the beginning, a prelude to a far greater clash. For the Sea Peoples had begun to mass not as scattered raiders but as an armada, a force large enough to challenge empires head-on. And their eyes were fixed on the delta of the Nile. The world's oldest kingdom was about to face its gravest test. The Nile. A river older than kings, more enduring than dynasties. For 2,000 years, Egypt had stood as a beacon of power, its monuments rising from the desert like eternal sentinels. Pharaohs had faced invaders before, the Hyksos, the Nubians, even the Hittites, and always, the Nile had survived. But now, in the early 12th century BC, a new storm approached from the sea, unlike any Egypt had ever known. From the north, dark sails gathered. Not a single fleet, but a tide of peoples, men, women, children, ox carts, warriors, entire nations on the move. They had burned the cities of Cyprus, toppled the palaces of the Mycenaeans, and shattered the Hittite Empire. Now their eyes turned south, to the fertile fields of the Nile Delta. If Egypt fell, the last great pillar of the Bronze Age world would crumble. The pharaoh who faced this storm was Ramses III, the second ruler of Egypt's 20th dynasty. He was no stranger to war, his inscriptions boast of campaigns against Libyans, Nubians, and revolts in Canaan. But the threat of the Sea Peoples was something larger, existential. In temple carvings at Medinet Habu, Ramses III ordered scenes of the coming battles to be immortalized in stone, vast fleets clashing in the delta, Egyptian archers raining arrows from ships, foreign warriors capsized into the waves. The reliefs are not mere art, they are propaganda, yes, but also testimony. Egypt had stood at the brink. Before the great confrontation, warning signs rippled through the kingdom. Refugees poured into Egyptian lands from the Levant, carrying tales of burned cities and advancing fleets. Egyptian officials recorded their movements, noting displaced groups seeking asylum or forced labor. In the north, coastal fortresses tightened their defenses. In the Nile Delta, Egypt prepared for invasion. The Sea Peoples advanced as both land armies and naval forces. Their ox carts carried families and supplies, their fleets bore warriors armed with long swords and round shields. They came not as raiders but as settlers, intending to carve new homes in Egyptian soil. The Mycenae Habu inscriptions describe them sweeping through all lands to the ends of the earth, leaving ruin in their path. And then, the clash. The Battle of the Delta stands as one of the most dramatic confrontations of the ancient world. Ramses III, anticipating the Sea People's movements, fortified the river mouths. Egyptian warships, sleek and swift, maneuvered to trap the invaders in the narrow waterways. Archers lined the decks and the riverbanks, their bows drawn, while soldiers waited with spears and axes to repel any who made landfall. When the fleets collided, chaos erupted. The reliefs show Sea People's ships overturning, their warriors thrown into the water, arrows piercing them as they struggled to swim. Egyptian ships, with their elevated platforms, rained destruction from above. On the banks, Egyptian infantry clashed with the migrants who had managed to land, their ox carts standing abandoned as desperate warriors fought to the last. It was a battle not just of armies, but of survival. For the Sea Peoples, victory meant a new homeland. For Egypt, defeat meant annihilation. Ramses III declared triumph. The Sea Peoples were destroyed, their remnants scattered, their families captured and resettled as vassals in Egyptian territory. In his inscriptions, the pharaoh boasts that he made them like those that exist not, erasing their threat from memory. Egypt had endured. But the truth was more complex. Though Ramses III had beaten back the invaders, Egypt itself had been scarred. The economy groaned under the weight of war. Grain shortages and worker strikes, the first recorded in history, shook the kingdom in the years that followed. Egypt had survived the Sea Peoples, but it would never again reach the heights of its former glory. And for the wider Bronze Age world, Ramses' victory was an exception. Elsewhere, cities lay in ruins, kingdoms toppled, cultures extinguished. The Hittites were gone. Mycenae in Greece collapsed into a dark age. Ugarit was no more. Only Egypt still stood, battered but unbroken. The peril had passed, for now. But the world had changed forever. The Sea Peoples, whether defeated or resettled, had left their mark. The balance of the Bronze Age had been shattered. A new, uncertain era was beginning. And beyond Egypt's walls, the fires still smoldered across the Mediterranean world. The temples of Mycenae Habu stand as stone chronicles, their walls carved with images of thunderous battles. Chariots charge, ships collide, arrows darken the skies. These are not quiet hymns of devotion but war memorials, where Ramses III, last of the warrior pharaohs, etched his defiance against the storm that threatened to erase Egypt from history. Ramses had inherited a kingdom still formidable but weary. The golden age of the new kingdom, of Thutmose III's conquests, of Akhenaten's heresies, of Ramses II's monumental legacy, was fading. Resources were strained, the bureaucracy bloated, the provinces restless. Yet when the Sea Peoples descended, the pharaoh rose to meet them with the full force of Egypt's ancient machine of war. The first great test came not in the delta, but on land. Around 1178 BC, the Sea Peoples allied with Libyan tribes to launch an invasion across Egypt's western frontier. From the deserts came columns of warriors and settlers, their families and ox carts, their warriors bearing strange helmets and broadswords. Ramses marched to intercept them, leading chariots, archers, and seasoned infantry. The clash was fierce. Egyptian archers loosed volleys that tore through advancing ranks, while chariots circled the battlefield, scattering formations. The Mycenae Habu inscriptions boast 1,000 slain, their leaders captured, their lands left desolate. Though undoubtedly exaggerated, the message is clear: Ramses had broken the invaders, proving that Egypt was no easy prey. But the victory was only a reprieve. Word soon reached the court that fleets were massing on the northern horizon. The Sea Peoples, undeterred by their Libyan allies' defeat, were preparing a strike at the very heart of Egypt, the delta itself. Here Ramses displayed not only ferocity but calculation. Anticipating their approach, he ordered the mouths of the Nile fortified. Egyptian ships, fitted with high decks for archers, were stationed in ambush. Infantry massed along the riverbanks, waiting to strike when the invaders landed. The stage was set for one of the most famous battles of the Bronze Age collapse. The inscriptions unfold the scene with dramatic flourish. The sea peoples advanced in their distinctive ships, their families following behind in carts along the coast. Their warriors carried round shields and long swords, their feathered headdresses standing tall against the sun. They believed Egypt would fall as so many other kingdoms had. Instead, they sailed into a trap. From the riverbanks, Egyptian archers unleashed volleys that rained down on the invaders' decks. Ramses' fleet surged forward, grappling enemy ships, overturning hulls. The reliefs show foreign warriors flung into the Nile, flailing as arrows strike them from above. Egyptian soldiers leapt aboard, cutting down survivors, while infantry on the shore annihilated those who managed to land. It was not merely a victory, it was annihilation. Ramses, ever the propagandist, recorded the outcome with ruthless pride. Those who came upon my frontier, their seed is not. Their hearts and souls are finished forever and ever. Yet, behind the triumphal rhetoric lay the reality. Egypt had survived the greatest migration of peoples in ancient memory. But it had paid a heavy price. Mobilizing such armies strained the treasury. The years that followed were marked by economic turmoil. Grain shortages led to the first recorded labor strike in history, as artisans at Deir el-Medina laid down their tools, demanding rations. The kingdom endured, but the cost of defense eroded its strength. Ramses III's reign would see further battles, further campaigns to maintain Egypt's frontiers. He pushed into Canaan to reassert control, quelling unrest among vassal states destabilized by the Sea People's movements. He fought Libyans again, repelling fresh incursions. He fortified Egypt's borders with garrisons and settlements. For a time, his presence held chaos at bay. But Egypt could not restore the world that had collapsed around it. The Hittite Empire was gone, its capital Hattusa a ruin. The Mycenaean palaces had fallen silent, their scribes vanished, their trade routes shattered. Cyprus smoldered, its towns rebuilt in diminished form. The Levant was scarred, its coastal cities occupied or abandoned. Egypt stood as the last great power of the Bronze Age, but it now stood alone. Ramses III's battles marked both the climax of Egypt's resilience and the beginning of its decline. He had fought with brilliance, defended with cunning, and carved his victories into eternal stone. But behind the temple walls, cracks widened, corruption in the priesthood, unrest among workers, and conspiracies even within his own palace. The very pharaoh who had defeated the Sea Peoples would later be the victim of an assassination plot, betrayed from within by his own wives and courtiers. The irony is sharp. Ramses III, who had faced down the storm of foreign invaders, could not escape the turbulence festering at home. Egypt had survived, but only just. The victories of Medinet Habu were triumphs, yes, but also epitaphs, marking the last age when Egypt could project such power. The battles of Ramses III had saved the kingdom from obliteration, but they had not saved the world. The Bronze Age was over. Its cities lay in ruin, its empires scattered to dust. In the wake of collapse, new peoples would rise, new kingdoms would form, and the memory of the Sea Peoples would fade into legend. But for now, in the temple walls of Thebes, Ramses III stands immortalized in stone, his ships triumphant, his enemies drowning, his armies invincible. The images proclaimed to the ages that Egypt had stood firm when all else fell. Yet beyond those carved reliefs, the world was still burning. Across the Mediterranean, silence spread where once there had been music, trade, and power. The Sea People's raids had been the spark, but the fires they lit consumed far more than palaces and ports. The world of the Bronze Age collapsed in slow devastation, leaving behind broken walls, empty streets, and the ghosts of forgotten kings. In Anatolia, the Hittite Empire, once a titan that rivaled Egypt, vanished almost overnight. Its capital, Hattusa, ringed with massive stone walls and lion-guarded gates, was reduced to rubble. The city that had once housed archives of thousands of clay tablets, recording treaties, prayers, and imperial decrees, was abandoned. The archives lay buried under the dust of centuries until modern excavators uncovered them. The words of kings survived, but the people who wrote them were gone. In Greece, the Mycenaean citadels crumbled. Mycenae, Tiryns, Pylos, all bore scars of fire and abandonment. Their palaces, where scribes had once recorded inventories of bronze, oil, and grain, fell silent. The linear B script, the earliest form of written Greek, disappeared, leaving centuries of illiteracy in its wake. The grand megarons, once echoing with feasts and poetry, became hollow shells. Later generations would look upon these ruins and weave myths, the tales of Agamemnon, of Troy, of heroes who lived in an age greater than their own. On Cyprus, once a hub of copper wealth, destruction was relentless. In Komi, Kidion, and other centers were burned and rebuilt, only to fall again. Storerooms once stacked with ingots of copper, the very foundation of the Bronze Age economy, lay shattered, looted, melted into weapons of survival. The island's prosperity dimmed, its influence broken. Along the Levantine coast, the jewel of Ugarit disappeared in flame. Its libraries, preserved in fire, speak of panic in its final days, letters unanswered, pleas for aid ignored. The bustling harbor, once filled with ships from Crete, Cyprus, and Egypt, sank into silence. Byblos and Tyre endured, but they were shadows of their former glory, survivors in a scarred landscape. Even inland, the collapse reached deep. Trade routes that had once stretched from Mesopotamia to the Aegean fractured. The Assyrians, future conquerors, retreated to their heartland, their ambitions checked by turmoil. Caravans ceased to arrive, merchants vanished, kingdoms withdrew behind walls. It was not only war. Climate played its hand. Drought gripped parts of the eastern Mediterranean, drying rivers and withering crops. Famine stalked cities already weakened by invasion. People abandoned fields, turning to raiding and migration. What the sea peoples destroyed with fire, hunger finished with silence. Archaeology paints the picture starkly. Across the region, layers of ash marked the end of one civilization after another. Cities burned and were never rebuilt. Scripts vanished. Pottery styles changed abruptly, reflecting a break in cultural traditions. For centuries, the eastern Mediterranean would endure what scholars now call a dark age. And yet, not all was lost. Out of ruin, new peoples rose. In the southern Levant, the Peleset, one of the groups among the sea peoples, settled permanently. The Philistines, remembered later in the Hebrew Bible, built new towns like Ashdod, Ashkelon, and Gaza. Their culture blended Aegean and local elements, a sign of how collapse birthed transformation. But in the eyes of those who lived through it, the age of gods and kings was ending. The Bronze Age world had been a system of great palaces, international treaties, and far-reaching trade. Now, the world had shrunk to villages, to survival, to local chieftains. A civilization of grandeur gave way to an age of hardship. The cities lay in ruin. And yet, in those ruins, the seeds of new worlds were already stirring. For while the Bronze Age had ended, history was not finished. The ashes would give rise to new kingdoms, new powers, and new stories. But for the peoples who watched their palaces burn and their libraries vanish into dust, it must have felt as if the world itself had collapsed. The old order was gone. And the question that haunted the survivors was simple: what would come next? The eastern Mediterranean at the dawn of the 12th century BCE was a graveyard of empires. Once great cities smoldered in ruins, their stones blackened, their palaces hollowed, their archives silent. The collapse was not a single event but a wave that spread across centuries, rolling from Anatolia to the Aegean, from Cyprus to Canaan, leaving in its wake a silence deeper than conquest alone. This was not merely the fall of kings. It was the collapse of a system. For centuries, the world had been bound by bronze, a metal born from the marriage of copper and tin, mined in distant lands, shipped by sea, hammered into weapons and tools. Bronze was the lifeblood of trade, and trade was the lifeblood of empire. But when the networks shattered, when harbors burned, when caravans vanished, when scribes no longer recorded shipments, the arteries of the Bronze Age world dried up. The age itself came to an end. The evidence lies buried in layers of earth. In the Greek world, pottery changed abruptly. The fine, decorated wares of the Mycenaean elite gave way to rougher, plainer forms, symbols of a society stripped of complexity. In Anatolia, monumental Hittite inscriptions ceased. The written word itself seemed to vanish into dust. Literacy flickered out, preserved only in Egypt, where Pharaoh's scribes still wrote on papyrus while the rest of the Mediterranean slipped into silence. Famine deepened the ruin. Tablets from Ugarit and Hattusa record desperate pleas for grain, warnings of starving cities unable to feed their people. Climate studies reveal prolonged drought, with harvests shrinking year after year. Farmers abandoned their fields, villages emptied, and the desperate turned to banditry and raiding. The sea peoples were both symptom and accelerant, raiders born from scarcity, but also destroyers who ensured no city could recover quickly. The human cost is almost beyond imagination. In one generation, kingdoms that had stood for centuries ceased to exist. Populations fled, migrating along coasts and rivers, leaving behind empty fortresses that became the bones of legends. For those who survived, the world must have seemed cursed, abandoned by the gods. Where once stood temples adorned in gold, now jackals wandered among the fallen stones. And yet, this collapse was not uniform. Egypt endured. The battles of Ramses III had checked the sea peoples at the Nile, and though Egypt weakened, it did not die. Along the Levantine coast, some cities rebuilt, Tyre and Sidon among them, destined to become cradles of Phoenician power in the centuries to come. In Greece, though writing disappeared, memories survived in song, in oral tales of warriors and burning cities. Centuries later, those stories would take form as the Iliad and the Odyssey, epic poetry that carried the echoes of the Bronze Age into the Iron World. What emerged from the ashes was a patchwork of survivors. The Philistines, one branch of the Sea Peoples, settled in Canaan and built new towns with strange, Aegean-inspired pottery. The Israelites, small highland tribes during the collapse, began to shape an identity in the power vacuum. Across Anatolia, new peoples moved into abandoned lands, the Phrygians in the west, the Neo-Hittites in the south. Out of destruction, a new order slowly, painfully, began to take shape. The Bronze Age world had been an age of palaces, archives, and international diplomacy. Its end ushered in centuries of darkness, where memory itself was fragile, carried not in tablets but in the songs of bards, in the myths of wandering peoples. It was a time when history dissolved into legend, when fact blurred with memory, when the fall of cities became the wars of gods and heroes. The Sea Peoples did not destroy the world alone, but they were the storm that broke its spine. They were the visible force in a deeper crisis, a convergence of climate, famine, rebellion, and war. Together, these forces reduced a glittering age to ash. But out of ash, history does not end. It waits, smoldering. For in the shadows of collapse, new civilizations stirred, peoples who would inherit the wreckage, who would carve the foundations of the world to come. The question was no longer who had fallen, but who would rise. The 12th century BCE was a graveyard for empires, but not all was silence. Amid the ruins, new voices began to rise. The Bronze Age had ended, but human ambition did not die with it. Instead, it adapted, reshaped by necessity, survival, and the inheritance of fallen worlds. Along the southern coast of Canaan, the Peleset, those remembered as the Philistines, took root. Once raiders on the sea, they became settlers on land. Ashdod, Ashkelon, Gaza, Gath, and Ekron grew into fortified towns, each a node in a confederation of power. Their pottery, painted with spirals and fishbone motifs, revealed echoes of their Aegean origins. Their hearths held feasts of barley, oil, and pork, a diet distinct from their neighbors. In these cities, the memory of the Sea Peoples lived on, not as fleeting destroyers but as founders of a lasting culture. To the north, the Phoenician cities rose from the ashes with quiet determination. Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos, survivors of the collapse, turned outward to the sea. With Egypt weakened and the Hittites gone, the Phoenicians filled the vacuum of trade. They became shipbuilders and merchants without equal, the future carriers of cedar wood, purple dye, and an alphabet that would transform the world. In the highlands of Canaan, small tribes gathered. They were not kings but shepherds and farmers, bound by faith and covenant. In time, these people, the early Israelites, would forge an identity distinct from their neighbors, shaped by the memory of oppression and the dream of a promised land. Their story, preserved in scripture, was born in this age of upheaval. Across Anatolia, fragments of the Hittite world clung to survival. In northern Syria, Neo-Hittite kingdoms such as Carchemish carried forward the traditions of their fallen empire, their walls still decorated with lions and gods in stone relief. To their east, the Assyrians, momentarily checked by chaos, began to regroup. They had endured the storm by retreating inward, conserving strength. Soon they would surge outward with renewed ferocity, carving an empire that would dominate the Iron Age. In Greece, the palaces were gone, but the people endured. Farmers and herders filled the valleys, while bards carried songs of heroes, Agamemnon, Achilles, Odysseus, legends that preserved memory when writing was lost. This oral tradition would outlast centuries of illiteracy, keeping alive the spirit of a world that had burned. When literacy returned, these tales would become Homer's epics, monuments of story more enduring than any palace. Cyprus, battered by repeated invasions, still clung to life. Its mines of copper, diminished, yet not exhausted, continued to feed the demand for metal, now shifting from bronze to iron. The shift was slow, but unstoppable. Where the Bronze Age had depended on long, fragile trade networks, iron could be forged locally. This single innovation gave rise to independence, resilience, and new forms of warfare. Out of scarcity, strength was born. What united these survivors was resilience. They were not heirs to a single empire but fragments scattered across a broken landscape. Yet from those fragments came diversity, new languages, new identities, new gods. The collapse had shattered the unity of the Bronze Age world, but it also cleared the stage for fresh beginnings. For the Sea Peoples, the story had turned full circle. From destroyers, they had become founders, woven into the fabric of the very lands they once attacked. For others, the Phoenicians, the Israelites, the Assyrians, the collapse was not an end but a beginning. They were the survivors who would shape the Iron Age, the kingdoms that would rise from ash to empire. The world had been remade. And as the 12th century gave way to the 11th, the ruins of palaces gave way to the seeds of nations. The Bronze Age was gone, but history had not ended. It was only beginning again. They came like a storm, and when the storm had passed, they left only questions. The Sea Peoples, those enigmatic raiders who toppled kingdoms, vanished into the very histories they had helped erase. No chronicles written by their own hands survive. No epic poem, no genealogy, no carved monument speaks in their voice. What remains are fragments, glimpses caught in the records of their enemies, and the silent testimony of ruins. In Egypt, their memory lingers in carved stone. On the walls of Medinet Habu, the mortuary temple of Ramses III, they are shown with feathered helmets, round shields, and ox-drawn carts, their families following as they clash with the pharaoh's armies. Hieroglyphs declare Egypt's triumph, yet in the careful lines of these carvings, the Sea Peoples endure, preserved in perpetuity by the very king who fought them. In the Levant, their legacy is tangible. The Philistines, descendants of those migrants, left behind pottery with swirling patterns reminiscent of the Aegean, and houses with hearths built in foreign style. Biblical texts remember them as antagonists, a people of giants and warriors, shaping Israelite identity through rivalry and conflict. Their name survives in the word Palestine, a linguistic echo that binds the present to that vanished age. In Greece, their memory is more elusive, woven into myth rather than record. The stories of wandering warriors, of cities sacked and kings slain, may carry faint reflections of the upheavals they caused. The fall of Troy, immortalized in Homer's Iliad, mirrors the fiery endings of countless Bronze Age strongholds. Were these epic shadows of real destruction, blurred into legend across centuries of oral song? The question lingers, unresolved. Archaeology fills in the silence with ash and debris. Burned layers across Cyprus, Anatolia, and Canaan whisper of fleets that descended without mercy. Broken walls, toppled idols, charred scrolls, these are their epitaphs. Yet archaeology also reveals their transformation, raiders who became settlers, destroyers who became cultivators, strangers who became part of the lands they once ravaged. Their origins remain debated. Were they displaced Mycenaeans fleeing famine? Mercenaries turned against their masters? Migrations from many lands converging in desperation? Perhaps all of these, perhaps more. The Sea Peoples are less a single nation than a phenomenon, an eruption of humanity under pressure, a migration wrapped in fire and myth. And in this lies their greatest legacy. They remind us how fragile civilizations can be. The Bronze Age world seemed eternal, palaces rising like mountains, kings commanding armies, gods enthroned in stone. Yet a combination of climate, famine, rebellion, and invasion brought it all crashing down. The Sea Peoples were the face of that collapse, the storm on the horizon that revealed the weakness of the system beneath. Even now, their mystery captivates. They are studied not only as destroyers but as harbingers of change, as participants in a transformation that birthed the Iron Age. They remind us that collapse is not only an ending but also a beginning, that in ruin lies renewal, and that the death of one age can give birth to another. Their voices are lost, but their impact is written into the stones of shattered cities, into the songs of survivors, into the very arc of history itself. They came from the sea, and like the sea, they receded, leaving behind echoes that still crash upon our shores. The Sea Peoples remain both real and spectral, raiders, settlers, strangers, and kin. A people without a homeland, yet with a legacy carved across the ruins of empires. Their story is not just of destruction, but of transformation. For in their wake, the world was reborn. And so the Bronze Age ended, and the Iron Age began. The torch of history passed from one world to the next, carried, in part, by those mysterious wanderers whom the ancients only knew as the Sea Peoples.